Okay, so the Arnold ROP is very similar to the Mantra ROP, and we just have to set it up in a slightly different way. So let's just work through some of these settings and explain what some of them do. So at the top we have render current frame, and we can also change this to the frame range and the steps. Here is where we would what we would use, if we want to render these guys to file. So if we want to render an image sequence. And below this, we can choose the take. So we can talk about takes a bit later. Below this, we have the main tab, the properties, archive, and scripts tab, but we're only really interested in these first two. So starting with the main tab, this is where we would select our camera, our objects, and the lights that we want to use. So looking here, we have candidate objects. If we have the asterisks, that means that we are rendering anything that is visible within the scene, anything that has this display flag on. We can choose to force objects here, but it's best to be careful, as some production assets within Houdini can be set up with multiple objects inside, and not all are meant to be seen or rendered. We also have phantom and matte, and these are used obviously to create objects that we render but only see the shadow, or objects that we render and also use as a matte, but we can show these again a little bit later. Below this we have the environment shaders, and we will look at these next week when we cover atmospherics, because this is where we would start to add in some of the Z depth and the fog if we wanted to use it that way. Export referenced materials is important because it looks inside the object or inside the alembics for material paths that we have set up. And these are the paths that we would have added using the material node. Now we'll switch this on later when we set up our final renders. Below this are some light options similar to what we have here. We can choose just a solo light, or we can render all the lights within the scene. We can force and exclude some lights. So before we move on to the properties tab, let's take a quick look at what bundles are, if you're not familiar with that. If I come back to this window, and at the top here, I will make a new pane type and find bundles. It's in here somewhere. Here we go. So bundles are groups of objects that we can quickly access in the render node rather than choose these objects manually. So here we can say create a new bundle, and we could name this spheres. We could add these spheres here. And we could obviously add as many objects as we want. And then within the out node, we could just use, say, at spheres, and that would render anything within that bundle. So in that way, we can set up environments within one bundle, characters within one bundle, we can create light bundles, etc., etc. For instance, let's just drop this into the matte option here and hit render. Cool. Now moving on to the properties tab, and on the output sub-tab, we have output picture. Now this is where we would choose where we want this to go. Let me just drop it here, for instance, as a quick test. And we always want to be rendering EXRs, so we get the highest amount of information. Now, of course, since we're rendering an image sequence, we would want this to be $F, which picks up the frame number, and it drops this in at the end. If we wanted to add some zeros in before this, we would use the pad 0 function. So let's just add that in. And we want the whole string to be maybe 5 zeros long. Let me just finish this. Cool. Now we have a few zeros there before the number. Below this, we have the override camera resolution, and this is important for when we're working with our lighting for efficiency's sake. And you'll see that we also have an overscan below, but I personally prefer to do this within the camera. I can't say I've ever used the denoise here. I usually add the denoise in comp. Okay, so this is already set up for EXR. And we already have ACES set up here. If we go to the pixel filter, this is already set up. This is the recommended options within Arnold. And at the bottom, we have the AOVs. Now, if you are unfamiliar with what an AOV is, these are render layers that exist within the final image, but we can split these for either reference purposes or to further edit in comp. If you're not familiar with compositing, then we will go into this in week 7. Although we won't directly cover theory, we will go over everything that you need to know to make this final image and look at adding the effects that we spoke about in week 1. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the AOVs. If I just hit plus here, you can see one pops out. And we have a drop-down menu for all the available AOVs. So let's add a few of these for now. Let's add normal. I'll press plus again. We can add the Z depth, the diffuse albedo, and let's just add the specular reflection. Now, another one that we definitely want to add is the cryptomat down here, sorry, at the bottom. But this is a little more involved to set up, and I'll make a separate video just to set up the cryptomats. So now if we hit render and remove it from matte, of course, let me go back to the main tab. And we press the drop down view bar here, we can take a look at what these AOVs look like. I can also press Shift and curly bracket to cycle through these passes. Now we won't see anything in Z until we expose it down, and you can start to see that we get the depth pass. One other AOV that we want to add is the pref. Let me just add this in. And this is just the reference position. So the N is the normal, or the bump, and we can use this to check the surface relief, or we can also use it to relight within comp. The Z is obviously the Z depth, and we can use this to add depth or atmos to the image. We can also use it to add some depth of field. We have pref here, and we also want to add the position. Again, we can use both of these within comp to change the local colors of objects that stick to the surface, so we don't have to, create animated masks within comp. So one last thing for the AOVs that I want to mention are the AOV light groups that we can use, and these are per light. So if I go inside this light here, this is the sunlight, Within contribution, I can add in, say, just call this one sun. And within this one, we call this env for environment. And now we just have to create some new AOVs that reference those light groups. So here I can start typing in RGBA sun. Change this to RGBA. And RGBA. Cool. So now if I hit render, these both should pop up. Okay, so now we have access to the sun and the environment light separately. So these are especially good for splitting off the lights in comp in case you want to change the intensity or the colour a bit later. Okay, so going back into the ROP, let's take a look at the sampling tab. So this is fairly standard for these renderers. We have the AA samples at 3, which is pretty good for LQR, but I would set this to 5 and the max to 8 if I wanted to create something that's a bit more final. We also have the adaptive threshold here, and the lower it is, the cleaner the image, but this of course increases render times. So these standard samples work well in most cases. If you wanted to further optimize, I would reduce these to 1, set your final pixel samples, and then increase these one at a time to reduce the noise. If noise persists, then it's best to check your lights again and only increase these slowly. In the ray depth tab, these settings are actually pretty high. I would take these down to 0 and increase them as you need them. The total ray depth here at the top acts as a threshold, allowing for no more than the set amount of trace depths. So generally, diffuse at 1 is pretty normal, but if the scene is too dark, you might need to go to 2, and on large scale environments, you might be able to set this to 0 without too much of an obvious change, but a definite decrease in render times, especially if you have a lot of things like trees and bushes and shrubs, etc. Specular can normally be set to 1, unless you have a scene with many reflective objects in close proximity that need to be accurate. Transmission here is refraction, so the more layers of refractive objects you have to trace through, the higher this needs to be, and it would be 1 for each hit. This also goes the same for the transparent objects. The low light threshold at the bottom cuts off any shadow rays that don't add anything to the final image, and for optimization, you would raise this as high as possible until you begin to see a noticeable difference. With the volume, it's similar to the diffuse, and this obviously only affects the volumes within your scene. The higher you go, the more light bounces you will get within that volume, and the brighter those volumes will become. Next here, we can enable the motion blur for the scene as a whole, or for any deforming objects in the scene using the shutter length to control the length of the blur. The last thing I want to explain here is just the Systems tab, and this is where you can change the bucket size. Unfortunately, unlike Mantra, the buckets will not follow the cursor. Cool, so that's all that we need to know for now, and that's all that we need to know to render our final image. And next we'll take a look at setting up a look depth scene and shading the trees. Thanks.